Welcome to Gotta Run with Will. My name is Melanie Eversley. I'm your host for today. This is part 2 on a series focused on the history of Black running clubs in New York City. With me today is Dr. Pamela Cooper Chenkin, who is author of The American Marathon and who also is working on a book about the history of Black running clubs and New York Pioneer Club. I think this would be a good time to talk about Boys of Yesteryear.
Yes.
And some of the athletic clubs with older athletes.
Okay. Well, in our first discussion, we talked about the great track club, the great multi-sport clubs that had track teams, the Smart Set, the Alpha Physical Culture Club, St. Christopher's, Salem Crescent, and there were a few others. The athletes got older. You know, this was before World War I that the clubs were organized. And the athletes got older, and the track clubs kind of faded. DeHart Hubbard, a great runner, started the Century Club in the 1920s, and later in the early 1930s, the Mercury Club started. But by 1930, Harlem really didn't have an AAU registered club. The Boys of Yesteryear, remember, they were old teammates, they had competed against each other and against the other, the white clubs. And they kept getting together for reunions. And at one reunion, they decided to form an organization, a fraternal organization that was very common among Black men in Harlem at the time. But they didn't model it on the typical fraternal organization. They modeled it on the Grand Street Boys, a Jewish organization that was integrated. They accepted, William Robinson was one of the charter members, was integrated and reached out for social welfare to the entire community. And they decided the Boys of Yesteryear would be a similar club. The founders were the same founders of the early track clubs, but some of the younger members who had been just runners included James Ravenel, who was very important to Tammany politics by this time, and Judge James Watson, who was one of the first Black judges elected. Again, very important in the Democratic Party. At this time, a lot of sports clubs, we have to keep this in mind, had some connection to the political parties of the time. So you have to keep in mind there might have been a connection to the Democratic Party. And they were modeled on the Grand Street Boys, a great Jewish organization. By 1933, Jonah Goldstein was president. Now, he was a protege of Lillian Wald, who was one of the founders of the NAACP. So he was very attuned and aware of situations in the Black community. In fact, he got some very good write-ups in the Amsterdam News. He was also a judge when he was running for elected office, he had shown sensitivity to the Black community. So they wanted something for Harlem youth. Something else happened at the same time. There were the very famous Harlem protests of 1935. And you know what the precipitating event was.
A young Black man was arrested.
Harlem Riot of 1935 started on March 19th of the same year in Crest 5 and Dime store. It began when 16-year-old Leno Riviera was caught trying to steal a 10-cent pocket knife. The police were called to the store and released Riviera through the back door of the store to avoid the crowd of spectators gathered out front.
The rumor spread that he was abused by the police, that by the security, that something happened.
Before the rioting started, groups led demonstrations outside the store. Unable to control the crowd and reassure them that Riviera was released by the police, the rioting started and lasted for 2 days. By the end of the disturbance, approximately 4,000 people were involved in the riot. Over 121 people were detained by the police. 57 civilians were injured. 3 people lost their lives. Over 300 businesses had property damage worth over $2 million.
And there was also a lot of protests in this time because the white department stores in Harlem the big stores were white owned and tended to employ white salespeople. there was a lot of Black entrepreneurship at Harlem, but they were small.
Right.
One stereotype was that the Black man could groom himself and bury himself. In other words, you could own an undertaker parlor or a barber shop, which were small enterprises.
Yeah.
But they weren't in the big entrepreneurial settings like department stores. So that was part of the protest. But if you look through the Amsterdam News, one of the big precipitating factors in the Harlem protests was the terrible state of Harlem schools and the way Harlem youth were being treated.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking about one of the articles which noted that some of the bathrooms were outdoors, and we were wondering, were they outhouses? How bad was the situation?
Right.
Even in in-school restrooms, there were no facilities for washing your hands.
Yeah. I know during Jim Crow in the South, you often had, Black schools using secondhand books that have been handed over to them from schools in the white community. Was situations like that,
it
broken
was
down
situations
furniture?
like that. It was also the way they were treating Black teachers.
Yeah.
And which was really important because this was a route to being middle class for Black women.
Right.
And they were given the worst assignments. They weren't advancing. Much later in the 1970s, 1971, there were 10 Black principals, and one of them was Ed Levy, hundreds of principals. But he was one of the first.
Okay.
So it was the way they were treating Black teachers. The New Deal was starting, but not that much for the Black community, and they were supporting the Democratic Party by then. There was a special need for jobs, but most of all, there was a need for recreational facilities for the youth. Certainly the schools weren't providing it.
Right.
I think there was something like, there was a program to build playgrounds throughout Manhattan, but only one was built in Harlem.
Wow.
So there was a lot of protests about that. So they wanted recreational facilities. The boys of yesteryear were old athletes, a lot of them old track athletes, and they thought the best recreational facility for a young man was an AAU track club. And actually, there were little meetings. Joe Yancey at that time was the coach of the Mercury Athletic Club. And Mercury,
what borough was that?
It was in Manhattan. Okay. It was in Manhattan. And it was a co-ed club. And according to Wally Donovan, the great track historian, Yancey was very annoyed that more and more social events were taking over.
Okay.
And that's often credited with why the New York Pioneer Club became a male-only club, but there were more factors in that.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about him and his background and what his family believed in?
They were very, very middle class. They came from the South, part of the Great Migration, which is another group that influenced the Harlem community. You and I were talking about, the Black community in New York, because that's the field we're both studying.
Right.
And you mentioned that people don't get the number of layers of different, that there was an established middle class. There was an entrepreneurial class.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely different layers. And it's also based on the part of the world you come from. Like my mother's family came to New York from North Carolina. And my father's parents were from Barbados and Jamaica. And in the Black community, that was kind of considered a mixed marriage because, they were, Caribbean and Southern Blacks. There was always like kind of a mistrust.
By 1930, about a quarter of the population of Harlem was of Caribbean descent. Like yourself, they had somebody in their family was of Caribbean descent.
Right.
And you mentioned North Carolina. And there were fraternal organizations, the Sons of North Carolina and the Sons of South Carolina. Yes,
and that fits the migration patterns because, the Southerners from, the eastern part of the South would come up to New York.
What I also need to mention now is you had some high-income individuals. You had the entrepreneurial class. You had judges. You had physicians and attorneys. but they were high income. And there's a big difference between being high income and having established inherited wealth.
Sure.
That's what was building the New York Athletic Club, and that's what had been behind Milrose.
Yes.
And you didn't have that in Harlem.
Right.
And that's always going to be a factor in the history of the New York Pioneer Club.
Yeah.
So what were they doing? So the New York Pioneer Club was established.
What year, roughly?
I will go with the date, April 15, 1936, because I have an article from the Amsterdam News, but Joe Yancey was having training runs with small groups of athletes as early as 1935.
Okay.
So they were thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the really interesting point was this was a track club for any boy who wanted to join.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. You didn't have to be good. Mm-hmm. Remember, you could be a black runner and get into a white club if you were good.
Right.
You could be a Jewish runner and get into if you were good.
Mm-hmm.
But this was for any boy who wanted to join.
Mm-hmm.
The track clubs back then would be about 25, 30 performing athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Yancey would accept anybody. Now, some of the runners who joined were very, very good, but this was really in the pattern of the Grand Street Boys Association. Mm-hmm. It was a social welfare organization.
Right.
So now we're stuck with, I remember when the New York Athletic Club wanted to build their big clubhouse, mm-hmm. members would contribute $20,000, and this was in the late 19th century. That was big money. So how was the Pioneer Club going to get money? Mm-hmm. Well, the boys, they held raffles, they had galas, they had dances. And that's how they funded this club. It was being funded by the black middle class. Okay. They were mostly from Harlem, mm-hmm. but it was for local boys. You didn't have to be good.
Yeah.
And you could join.
Where would they run?
They were running at McCombs Dam Park in the Bronx, and that's where Joe Yancey was having those 1935 little gatherings. Okay. I'm still trying to document them.
Track that's now named after him.
Yes, yes. A lot of this is my ongoing research.
Yeah.
Where was the money going to come from? They would have an annual dinner where they would invite athletes and people to speak. And one of the people they had to speak was Jonah Goldstein. Mm-hmm. I am trying to document this, and I will find it if it exists. I am sure the Grand Street Boys were helping them.
Yeah.
And I am quite sure there was some financial aid from someone in Tammany.
Right.
Because the Grand Street Boys were also affiliated with Tammany.
Sure.
The boys of Yesteryear were affiliated with Tammany.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is all part of the Democratic Party. Okay. So I'm sure that sort of thing was going on.
Yeah.
Joe Yancey never took money. He had started in his father's undertaking establishment, and he later became a part of the Internal Revenue. I'm choking over the words. That's my own problem. But he was a collector for Internal Revenue.
Oh, boy.
But wait a minute, but this was very important for a black man to have a civil service job.
Sure, yes.
Jim Herbert became a post office worker. Mm-hmm. I remember my husband finding an article in the Times about a great runner, and then he ended up working for the post office, and my husband felt kind of sad about it, and I was like, no, if you were a black man back then, that was the only security, a civil service position.
Right. Yeah, and also in a lot of segregated black communities, being an undertaker or being a barber, other things where you were, where there would always be a need for you, sadly, and where you were serving, just the black community. Those were all often roads to wealth also, and still are today in some places.
So the black middle class had the burden pretty much of funding the New York Pioneer Club.
Okay.
Through dances, through events.
Yeah.
I remember one event where Joe Yancey was holding it at the Armory and asking for donations of hot dogs. This is the gala event.
Yeah.
They're trying very hard. So this is all before World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But things were happening, especially when A. Philip Randolph proposed a march on Washington, unless President Roosevelt signed into legislation the opening of civil service jobs, of all the jobs in war preparation for the African American community, that it was all open.
Right.
One of the runners he had was a young man named Leonard Bates.
Yeah, I've heard of him. Let me just mention.
Yes, please.
In the course of our conversations leading up to this, I've learned so much from you. Leonard Bates is my cousin. I had no idea of this part of his history. The last time I saw him, I was maybe 12. And I remember when I was young, seeing a large photo at the apartment that he shared with his wife, Myrtle, who's my blood cousin, of him in his football uniform. And I remember hearing that he was a football star, but I had no idea. It's just kind of funny to me that to learn through you that he was a member of the Pioneer Club and he was part of this movement that you're about to talk about. I had no idea. And I've been learning about the Pioneer Club over the last few years. So thank you for helping to educate me about my family.
Okay. There's an excellent book by Donald Spivey. He's a professor at the University of Miami called Racism, Activism, and Integrity in College Football, the Bates Must Play Movement. And this was at NYU in the 1940s. Lenny Bates, who incidentally was a runner before he was a football star, loved running, was recruited for the NYU football team. At that time, they were planning a football game, because I'm a track person, but a football game in Missouri, and he wasn't going to be allowed to go. It would have been October 1940, and he would be left, even though he was one of their star players, he was not allowed to go. Because in the South, when you traveled to the South and you had a black person on your team, that person had to stay at home because of the Jim Crow in the South. And it was a gentleman's agreement. So 7 students got together and started a protest group over saying Bates must play. Bates was left at home. He did not go to play Missouri. Incidentally, NYU lost. I think it was 33-0. They really needed Bates on the team. They really needed Bates on the team. And the 7 students, and I think at least 5 of them, there were 5 of them were white and Jewish. The 7 students were later suspended for participating in this enormous protest. I won't speak too much about it. It's all done in the book.
Sure. They were the Bates 7.
They were the Bates 7. They were later apologized to, I think, around the year 2000, 2001.
Okay.
But Bates did not play.
Yeah.
And, okay, this was really important. Joe Yancey was starting this club. This is about 1940 and 1941. Lenny Bates was a pioneer. When this was happening, right before this happened, he was competing for the New York Pioneer Club. At that time, relations between the AAU and the NCAA were not as bad as they got in the 1960s. The NCAA had its first track meets in 1921, and it took a while for college track to really, college, all right, it's NCAA. It took a while for them to realize college track could be profitable.
Okay.
And take more of an interest. So it was still the AAU. So you could compete for your AAU team, and your college team. And that's what Lenny Bates was doing. He was competing as a pioneer.
Wow.
And he was competing as a pioneer afterwards, still winning awards for the pioneers in 1943.
Yeah.
When he graduated.
You know what?
But there was Joe Yancey had to see this. It was his own team member, seeing you'd go to the South and you can't have an integrated team.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Something else happened, and Joe Yancey has been criticized I don't know if I should say this now or later, he has always been criticized
I know what you're
for
gonna say.
not allowing, we keep talking about it, for not allowing women on the team.
Yeah.
Let's talk about why he didn't allow women on the team. Wally Donovan said, well, too social. No. I'd like to read from Spivey's book. So Lenny Bates is on the Violets track team. Okay? Coach Stevens and others told him that they expected him to act as a gentleman at all times and to obey the rules and traditions of Violets football. Those rules and traditions consisted of many things. At the top of the list was the unwritten rule that his good friend Jim Herbert was a great and, to my opinion, underrated track runner. That his good friend Jim Herbert told him was the most sacred rule of all. Quote, never be seen with a white girl. End quote. Herbert knew what he was talking about. On one occasion during his first year on the track team, a young white co-ed who was in one of his classes stopped to say hello when she spotted him at track practice. The two of them only spoke for a minute or two, but that was enough. Herbert informed his friend Lenny that the track coach had him in his office, quote, before my foot hit the ground, end quote. The coach wanted to know what was that all about. Herbert explained to the coach that the young woman in question was a classmate and merely stopped to say hello. The coach did not threaten him, but gave Herbert a piece of good advice that he in turn was passing on to Lenny. Quote, a white girl will get you kicked out of here faster than failing grades, end quote. The message was clear. Interracial dating was strictly taboo. It was unnecessary to warn Bates at any rate. He was married and not much for socializing on or off track. I think this had a profound effect on Joe Yancey.
Yeah.
If you're going to challenge the rules that said that you have to leave Black players at home when you travel in the South, one challenge at a time.
Right.
You do not confuse it by having women on the team.
Yeah. I think that over the years, a Black man just even conversing with a white woman led to major situations such as the Tulsa Race Massacre.
The story of the deadliest race massacre in American history begins with two individuals.
On Memorial Day, May 30th, 1921, a young African-American male is walking in downtown Tulsa on Main Street. He worked in a white patronized shoeshine parlor where there were no toilet facilities for African Americans. So the white owner of the parlor arranged it so his African American employees would walk down Main Street, go to the Drexel building, ride the elevator to the 4th floor where there was a colored bathroom. And the elevator operator in the Drexel building was a young white teenager named Sarah Page.
We don't know exactly what happened, but we know something happened. She was not expecting him, and she screamed.
And then Dick Rowland is seen running out of the Drexel building.
It's understandable that he might be protective of his athletes.
He was protective of his athletes, but that was not the point. He was a civil rights activist. Joe Yancey was a civil rights activist. He had a goal, and he knew how to go about achieving it. Let's see, in 1946, the Pioneers became team champions in the Metropolitan Junior Track and Field Games. But they refused to attend the upcoming June 1946 AAU National Track and Field Championships in San Antonio, Texas, because they were going to be put in separate quarters. Now, the Black members were traveling with the white members to the event, but the white people had to stay in a hotel, and the Black athletes were being given, and this is very interesting, they had luxurious accommodations at the home of a local Black millionaire.
Yeah.
Okay, they're young men, and you know what it's like when you stay in somebody's home. You feel kind of, you're constricted. In a hotel, there's more anonymity.
Right, right.
And Joe Yancey refused to attend. And the Grand Street Boys, under the leadership of Jonah Goldstein, backed him up, and they didn't send their athletes.
Okay. I wonder how much of that the athletes absorbed, kind of like through osmosis, observing how Joe Yancey handled himself. Because I often look at just how accomplished all the members of the Pioneer Club went on to become in adulthood. We had John Carlos, who's famous for the Black Power sign at the Olympics, and
Yeah, well, we're still in the 1940s.
Okay.
What about Judge Bruce Wright?
Judge Bruce
We
Wright.
both read his books.
Yes.
He ran for the Pioneers. He credited them with making him strong enough to withstand boot camp
Yeah.
when he was in the Army. And when I read his book, there was that little bit of poetry at the beginning of every chapter.
We're talking about black robes, white justice.
And yes, and of course, I was going through just looking for the good stuff about track and field. And so I skipped over that poetry stuff.
Sure.
But I'm reading it and it's like, what a wonderful writer. This is beautiful poetic writing. And then I realized that poetry was his.
Yeah.
And everything you read about it, nobody mentions he was a good poet.
Right. Right.
And a member of the Pioneer Track Club.
Yes.
And he ran for them in 1940.
Roscoe Brown. I remember
Okay,
that?
there are
The
two.
Tuskegee
Roscoe Lee Brown,
Right.
who the actor,
The
and
actor.
Roscoe C. Brown, who was the Tuskegee Airman.
Right. And who was a pioneer?
Both of them,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Wow.
These were very important people. So
Yeah.
Joe Yancey is staging this protest. We go as a team or we won't go. And they're missing out on a very good track team.
Right. Right.
Something else about the Grand Street Boys, they're backing them up. In 1939, Jonah Goldstein was called as one of the speakers to one of the Pioneer Club dinners. I am quite sure he brought with him a check. This is going to be hard to track because the Grand Street Boys by then numbered in the thousands. It was a big club, they had a big clubhouse, and it might have been the way under the table money was arranged later on. It was a check from a particular individual to another particular individual. So you really couldn't trace it.
Okay. That's very cool.
And in 1948, the Pioneers, now an integrated team, they were integrated in 1942.
Okay.
Okay? Right after Bates Must Play, right after that incident, they wrote it into their constitution that they were an integrated team.
Right. Right.
And Joe Yancey said that they really became a winning team after they integrated.
Yeah.
And a lot of the early white athletes going to the Pioneer Club were Jewish. I don't know if this was the influence of the Grand Street Boys. Remember, it was a developmental club. You didn't have to be good.
And yet they were.
Yes.
You know.
In 1948, they sent their first Olympian, and he was Irving Monshine.
Okay.
And so in 1951 and 55, again, they won national championships. So they had become a major and winning team.
Yeah.
Well, let's see, from 1948 to 1958, they had an indoor track races.
Yeah.
Their own indoor track meet. And it was a very important meet. It stopped after 1958. And I think that's for another session about why the Pioneer Track Club declined.
Well, this time, I want to thank my guest, Dr. Pamela Cooper Chenkin. We've been talking about the history of Black New York City track clubs. This is part 2 of a series. I'm Melanie Eversley. Thanks so much to Will Sanchez for the opportunity. And thanks so much to Manhattan Neighborhood Network. And as always, gotta run.